Because then once I do that, I'm able to get into my keynote presentation. There we go. Okay. Screen sharing has failed. Please try again. Let's try that again.
It's not working because we tested it and it worked.
Oh, no, you're absolutely right. We'll try this one more time.
There you go.
There we go. Much better. It was my fault. Yep.
All righty then. All right. So, good evening, everyone. I hope, oh, wait, there's one more thing I have to do. All right, thanks for your patience, everybody. I wanted to get the live on Facebook part of this presentation started so that folks who are not logging in through the Zoom interface are able to watch this presentation on the library's Facebook page. Again, my name is Amy Lutsky. I work at the Dwight Foster Public Library in Fort Atkinson, and I was contacted by our speaker this evening last year, who described a variety of presentations that he does and the work that he does in art and photography and underwater or deep sea diving, deep lake diving. He's the founder and producer of the Milwaukee Amateur Underwater Film Festival. He's founder of the Great Lakes Shipwreck Photo Contest. He's the past curator of the Our World Underwater Art Flows Like Water art exhibition, as well as a trustee of the Wisconsin Maritime Historical Society and a member of the Wisconsin Underwater Archaeology Association. I think that would be an interesting presentation in and of itself. He's also an entrepreneur. He's founded Milwaukee Dive Apparel, a designer retailer of unique apparel for Great Lake dives. So he is here this evening to talk to us about a ship that was found in Lake Michigan, and I believe the process of doing that, and then how the individuals involved figured out what the ship was that they had found. So Ross, I am going to turn this over to you.
Cal, actually.
Oh.
Oh. Ross, we can talk to Ross later.
I'm reading Ross's name at the top. Yes, yeah. Our primary speaker is Cal.
Thank you for that introduction, Amy, and thank you for you and Fort Atkinson Library for inviting me to do this tonight. It's a real honor. Also, I'm just gonna, a little bit of shameless self-promotion before we get started here. So I've made pretty good use of my COVID time this year. I started a little venture that I call Boats 1200. And what that is basically museum quality ship models in 1/1200th scale. And that's pretty small. If you look at the picture on the left of with me, there's 4 Edmund Fitzgerald models on the table in front of me. The cool thing about this size is you can collect many of them. You don't need a big room in your house to display them. And they're also pretty affordable because they're small, but they are very detailed and authentic. And the first boat I started out with was the Edmund Fitzgerald, the most famous freighter in the Great Lakes. And there's 4 versions of that to choose from. And now I've got a brand new model coming out within a couple of weeks, the Rouse Simmons, which is also known as the Christmas tree ship. And that will be available in just a few weeks. So that's my latest venture, and it's keeping me out of trouble. And so if anybody's interested in purchasing one, please go to my website, calsworld.net on the web, or else Boats 1200 on Facebook. Enough of the advertising. Let's launch into why we're all here tonight. So thank you very much for taking time out of your busy lives to maybe take a little breather for 45 minutes and learn about the most intact schooner in the world. And that is the W.C. Kimball. And that is, think about that for a moment. It's a pretty bold statement. Some of you probably think I'm even exaggerating, but we're going to spend the next 45 minutes and we're going to go over this incredible shipwreck from stem to stern. And we're going to look at all the reasons why I feel confident that I can make that claim. And we're also going to learn about the forensic clues that lie there on the bottom of the lake that helped us to finally put a name to this sail off.
And Cal, I'm going to interrupt you for one moment. I did forget to mention that if you have questions during the presentation, feel free in the chat section to put in your question, and then we have time for a Q&A at the end of the presentation. So,
absolutely. Thank you for remembering, Amy, because I completely forgot as well. So, yep, I'll answer any questions you have at the end of the presentation. So hopefully you'll have some. Okay, September of 2018, summer was slipping away, and Shipwreck Hunter and Ross Richardson was out for one last family boat ride of the year. And on their way to South Manitou Island, Ross turned on his sonar as he usually does. And within a few minutes, it revealed a pretty curious target. He bookmarked that location on the GPS, and he noted that whatever it was he had just found, it was pretty deep, about 300 feet. And it also came up off the bottom, nearly 90 feet as well. And this was something that he would definitely have to come back to and take a closer look at a different point in time, and hopefully with a diver. Now, from these images, we all thought there was a really good chance that he had found a schooner, but sonar images can be really deceiving, and they're tricky to read sometimes. And the only way to really know for sure what it is that is on the bottom is to put eyes on it, either a drop camera or an ROV, better yet, a diver. So Ross Richardson is a technical diver. He's good to about 175 feet, but he hadn't been diving much in the last several years. And I'm a technical diver. I'm good to about 200 feet max bottom myself, but that's not even deep enough to get to the top of what it was that was sticking up off the bottom of the lake. But our friend and technical diver, Steve Weimer, he's good to about 300 feet and beyond. So he was the chosen one. He was the one who'd be able to put eyes on the mysterious anomaly that Ross had found. And of course, he couldn't wait, because really this is what wreck divers' dreams are made of. The chance to perhaps be the first person to see something that's been lost to history for sometimes more than a century. At the end of September, just a few weeks after Ross had found the object, Steve traveled from his home in Milwaukee to Ross's home in Lake Ann, Michigan, to hopefully get a chance to make a dive. And that's assuming the big lake allows it, because weather at that time of the year, it can be nice or it can keep you on the shore. It's really a crapshoot. And it's a long way to drive for just a chance. Unfortunately, I was not able to join on that trip, and it was killing me to not be there, even if it was just as surface support. They got lucky though. Lake Michigan cooperated, and Steve did make a dive, a first discovery dive on that target, and Ross set up his GoPro to record Steve's initial reactions and thoughts about the dive as soon as he was back aboard. So let's take a real quick look at some of that footage.
I saw nothing that had a name on it. It's a little schooner, 2 masts, a stern, and there's a little wheel on it. There's an aft cabin still there. There's 2 hatches. The hatches are little. They're maybe like 6 feet by 4 feet. There's one right forward of the aft cabin, and then there's one behind the forward mast. They're covered. I couldn't reach in. They're covered with wood. Wood covers over. The aft cabin totally intact. There's a little windlass. I'm trying to think. I don't know if I saw an anchor on the port side, but there's an anchor on the starboard side sitting there. I got pictures of it. I couldn't get any video because I couldn't switch the buttons. I just had to shoot where it was. But it's all intact. I got a picture of the stern. I couldn't read a name or anything there. I got pictures from each side of the bow where it looks like, like there's a smooth part where there would have been a name, but I couldn't read anything.
What length would you estimate it at?
It's 100 feet or less. The bowsprit's there. It's all intact. It's just a cute little wooden.
Well, it doesn't sound big enough to be the herd. The herd would have been pretty darn big. So you would call this a fairly intact shipwreck?
It's just about totally intact.
So now we knew for certain that Ross had found a schooner, and from what Steve said, a pretty intact one at that. Steve also made a reference in that interview to being unable to work the buttons on his camera housing. That's because the camera rig that he was using on that dive was only rated to 200 feet max depth, and he was diving at nearly 300 feet. And even though that pressure did not cause a flood, it did keep Steve from being able to switch modes on his camera and do a bunch of other stuff. So it limited him to only capturing a few very intriguing still photos. Those images we're going to look at in a few seconds here, and that's what Ross texted me that night. So the first picture that I saw was of the bow. And from this image, we can see the somewhat rare clipper bow here. It's not the straight up and down cutwater that you would normally see on a lake schooner. This was a clue as to where the boat was made. Boatyards in Manitowoc and Milwaukee, Wisconsin were known for this unique but rare style of hull design. And we can also see that the bowsprit at least is still there. We don't know if the jib boom, which is the extension of that, is in here from the photo, but we see the bowsprit. We see some standing rigging such as these chain bobstays, and we can see an anchor line here coming out of the hawse hole. So there's a lot of good information in this photo. Shot number 2 shows one of the things we love to see most, an intact cabin. Many times when schooners founder, the cabin will blow off due to air pressure. And this one appears to not only be there, but it's in really good condition. So it's also our first look at the deck of the vessel, which from this photo seems to be all there. I don't see a single missing board in the deck. We can also glimpse the aft hatch cover underneath here, and that is, well, that's unheard of. I've dove on and photographed schooners in all 5 of the Great Lakes personally. I've never seen a hatch cover in place on one, so very, very rare. This will actually end up being a hindrance to our identification process in the end. We can also see something that we think is iron rope sitting on top the hatch cover. This is part of the standing rigging that was made of partial wire, not just hemp rope. This was not something that was used until after the Civil War. So this helps us narrow down the age of the vessel to post-Civil War or after 1865. Also, we can see some dead eyes along that port rail here. Shot 3, oh man, that would have been the money shot if only it had been that simple, if there'd been a name painted or a name board across the transom, but that would have been way too easy. This photo does, however, give us our first look at something else rare and remarkable in the world of schooner shipwrecks, and that's at least one standing mast. And not just the mast, but there's a trestle tree there, which is what people commonly think of as a crow's nest, and the top mast, which is the second top part of that, all standing. And according to Steve's verbal account, he did confirm that the vessel actually has 2 standing masts, even though we can't see it in this photo. Also, the board that's popped right here on the corner on the transom, it's kind of popped loose, is one of the very rare pieces of deterioration on this wreck at all. The final image is really interesting. It's the yawl boat. We can discern several things from this photo. A, it's on the lake bottom, and according to Steve, it's on the stern or at the stern, which is where it would have been stowed. B, it's in great condition with only one broken seat. C, it still has an oar in it. Amazing. D, it has several holes in the side of the vessel from where it banged against the Kimball as it was dragged down with it. And finally, we can see a strong back, a metal brace that would have given a convex contour to a tarp covering that so it wouldn't have filled with rainwater. So this is what we had to go on to begin figuring out what it was that Ross had stumbled across. And from all indications in these few photos and Steve's firsthand account, the vessel was in absolutely incredible condition, maybe better than anything else we'd ever seen. It was enough to drive us crazy though, not being able to dive it again because it was the end of the dive season. There would be an entire winter of wondering what her name was, what her story would be, how she got there. In order to solve this mystery, Ross put together a team of several individuals, And each member of the team brought, of course, their own unique skill sets to the project. Ross was the shipwreck hunter who found her in the first place, but he's also a fantastic researcher. His idea of a good time is poring over hundreds of old articles, journal entries, photos, sniffing out those obscure bits of ancient history and records. Steve brings the ability to safely dive to 300 feet and get the stills in the video of what he sees and bring them back. I acted as a maritime consultant, as well as the artist who could create a painting of the wreck from the photos and the video we'd collect. Now, Brian was our ROV pilot, Brent was topside support, and Roger was there as a historical advisor and a documentary filmmaker. So between the 6 of us, we felt pretty confident that we had this thing surrounded and we were going to get it taken care of. By late October, Ross had now gone over literally hundreds of newspaper clippings, photos, journal entries, and based on vessel size, type, and location, he'd found a strong contender, the Emily. She was a 2-masted schooner built in Wisconsin and lost with all hands in an April gale in 1857. Now, for months, Ross tried making the details of the Emily's loss match up with what we had and where it sat. But there were some discrepancies with the reported location of her loss. Namely, our wreck was just too far from where the Emily should be. And another thing that was giving us pause was, why was there a parent iron rope on an antebellum wreck? Was it possible that the stiff rigging in Steve's image was not wire rope? What if it just hadn't rotted away yet like a lot of the other rigging? I even proposed that it was possibly tarred or coated to keep it from weathering as fast as the untreated running rigging. This was a common practice on ocean vessels since the 18th century, but I was unable to find anyone who could tell me if 19th century lake schooners ever did this. Not even our state underwater archaeologists knew. So undeterred, Ross kept searching for a better fit. And by early April of 2019, Ross had now gone over literally thousands of newspaper clippings and photos. He found another obscure loss that few people had ever heard of, and there was a photo of the vessel too. It was the W.C. Kimball. It was built in Manitowoc, Wisconsin in 1891, and she was registered at 63 feet in length. Many vessels from the 1800s never had their photo taken, right? Because iPhotos were still a few years off. But luckily for us, this one did. And from the photo, we can see that she has that unique clipper bow that we have on our wreck and a very sleek stern. This thing was the pocket rocket of its day. It was probably fast and it was probably easy to handle with a small crew. We liked most every part of this photo when it came to matching it up with what we actually had sitting on the bottom of the lake. She was rigged right, and Steve thought the size was pretty close from what he could remember. So the 2019 dive season was just around the corner, and we needed a game plan for the highly anticipated second dive. I came up with a list of things that I felt we needed to do in order to help identify the wreck. We needed comprehensive video of the stern cabin to match the number of windows and openings and the general size and shape with the wreck and with the photo. We needed length and beam measurements of the wreck too, so we could match those with historical enrollment records. And it would be nice if we could take a closer look at those hatch covers to see if there was any way that we could glimpse a look into that hold, because we knew from records that the Kimball had been carrying 200 barrels of salt in her hold when she went missing. So if we could get a look inside the cargo hold somehow and see barrels or barrel hoops, that would have been our smoking gun, short of a name actually being painted somewhere on it. Now, while studying this photo, I actually saw something that I'd never seen before, and it's circled in yellow. It's a running light box that's mounted on top of a pole. I'd never seen it on schooners like this before or on wrecks. These navigational lights were common on other types of vessels, but I'd never seen them on schooners, like I said before. It occurred to me that at the very least, the glass lens would not rust or rot, and that it would be laying either on the deck or on the bottom of the lake. And if it wasn't covered in too much silt, If we could find one of those, that could be our smoking gun if we were unable to glimpse a look into the hold. 6 of us were actually able to get our schedules to all coincide for one upcoming weekend, and we couldn't come up with a rain date, so this was our one chance to do this together as a group, and we were depending on Lake Michigan to cooperate, and we all know how well that works out. If we got weathered off the lake, though, all wouldn't be lost. I'm sure there would have been plenty of camaraderie and beer drinking, general hijinks. We would have had a lot of fun, probably consumed a lot of cheeseburgers, but the chance to put everyone all in one spot at the same time was this weekend. And so after about a 3-hour delay, while we waited for large waves to subside and the lake to just get calm, 6 of us boarded Ross's 20-foot bayliner and we headed out to the wreck site. And unlike most afternoon trips on the lake, the longer we were out there, the flatter and calmer it got. That's really kind of rare. Steve was able to make a successful dive of 17 minutes bottom time, and he had a total run time of 74 minutes in the water. Now, this was mid-May, so there was no layer of warmer water near the surface, and water temps were about 42 degrees Fahrenheit top to bottom. Very cold. And even with argon as a suit gas and a heated vest, Steve was a human popsicle by the time he got back to the surface. We had a hot cup of coffee waiting for him once he got aboard the boat, but he was shaking so uncontrollably that not a stitch of it passed his lips. It all ended up on the floor of the boat. Now, this photo that we're looking at here, I shot obviously with my drone, and it really exemplifies the great weather that we were blessed with to make that dive, but it also shows the enormity of the lakes. This little thing right here, that's our boat. So imagine trying to find something a little more than 3 times our own size, 300 feet below us. That's what it's like trying to hook into this wreck so a diver can go down. A physical line attaching us to the shipwreck below is needed. It's not only just to keep the dive boat over the wreck, but it's also a visual reference for Steve on the way down and on the way back up. And it's his lifeline to the dive boat, so he isn't lost at sea. Now, fear of damaging this fragile wooden time capsule by hooking into it is one of the reasons that we all decided after the second dive we would not be going back to the wreck again. Hopefully the scale depth chart that you're looking at here puts into perspective the difficulty with grappling a wreck 300 feet down. Basically, we're dragging a 20-pound metal hook across the lake bottom until the line goes taut. Now, the drag of that polypropylene line that it's attached to in the water, it causes the hook to not hang straight down and certainly not straight below the boat. And if there's any midwater currents that are different from the surface or the bottom, that line ends up looking like a zigzag. 300 feet's a long way down. Another way to visualize it is if you take a football field and put it end on end. That's how far away we were trying to hook this thing. But Ross piloted us right over the target, and within a few minutes, our line did go taut. Before putting Steve in the water, we sent Brian's ROV down to confirm that the hook was in fact on the wreck and to see where. Because if we weren't on the wreck, sending Steve down 300 feet to find out the hard way that we were hooked into a dead tree or a large rock, well, it would have scratched any other attempt on a dive for a dive on the wreck that afternoon if we actually had found the wreck. So it made good sense to put that ROV in the water right away. And it's a good thing we did, because here's what we found. We had 2 concerns. First, we wanted to be sure that that line wasn't actually across the mast. God forbid we should pull one of those delicate masts down. And also, secondly, we felt that the hook could come off at any time. And you can see it's just bouncing up and down with the 6-foot waves that we're experiencing on the surface. It could have come off at any moment. It was a very tentative connection, and we didn't feel it was safe to put Steve in the water. So we repositioned the hook and once again sent that ROV down, and what we saw was this. The hook had moved a few feet and it was now between the cabin and the incredibly fragile but completely intact wheel. And this was not a whole lot better, but it was a little better. And we felt it was kind of now or never for Steve's dive. The daylight hours were getting short. He was suited up. He was anxious to get in. He wanted to dive. So we put him in the water. We let him do his thing. And I'm just going to show you a little bit about, again, how tenuous that connection is. You can see that hook just kind of moving up and down. I think at this point we had like four-inch waves on the surface. So we really got lucky that way. Probably by now, you're thinking you'd like to see some more video of the wreck. I know I would. So we're going to take a look at the video that Steve shot while he swam the path that is shown on your screen right now. Started at the stern, worked his way up to the bow, and then came back. And he really did a great job of hitting all the major talking points on this wreck. And I'll just give some overview as we see the video. So this, again, is video from 300 feet down in Lake Michigan, shot by Steve Weimer on his second and last dive on the Kimball. We're going to start off looking at the stern and that yawl boat, which is sitting on the lake bottom, where when the lines that it dangled off the davits from rotted away, it would have settled there to the lake. Also, it took one of the davits with it. One of the davits, the starboard one, pulled out of its socket on the vessel, was still attached to the yawl boat, and it's now on the lake bottom next to it. And you could also see those holes in there. Here's that board that's popped up there, and we're going to come up over the rail and see that intact cabin. We're going to see a mooring bit and some steering gear, the wheel. Moving forward here towards the cabin is a window with no glass. None of the windows have glass in them. Presumably broken out when water rushed in as it sank. But one of the interesting things, I'm going to pause it right here. There is another wall just inside the exterior wall of the cabin with another window placed in exactly the same spot. We suspect that that small area was actually a corridor of some sort that would have allowed access from the cabin into the hold of the ship should they need to get it. In later video, we're going to see that there's a third window on the other side of the cabin, and you can actually see straight through the entire cabin. And I apologize, I just hit the wrong button. Get caught back up here to where we were. Okay. We're going to continue along towards the bow of the boat along the starboard rail. On the left, we can see the aft hatch and access cargo hatch and cover. There are dead eyes and chain plate for the main mast. Also, the top boom and boom from the foresail are laying on that. That's what's those poles coming out at us on the rail. Continuing to move forward, those lights in the distance on the right top is Brian's ROV. He was down there filming Steve while Steve was filming the wreck. More chain plate and dead eyes for the forward mast. Now, really nice look at her one and only anchor, still stowed where it would have been, with the anchor chain coming out of the hawse hole. We're going to come up over the rail here, and we're going to glimpse not only a really intact windlass, but if you look on the bottom left on the deck here is that running light box that we thought we should see. Also, we're looking at the forward mast with sail hoops and a bunch of rigging collapsed around it as well. Underneath all that rigging is the forward hatch cover, completely intact. Look at that deck. There is not a single board missing. This is really rare, folks. You don't normally see this in Great Lakes wooden shipwrecks from this age. Also, I'd like to make a special note of the rail. It's really, really low. It's maybe it would come up halfway up your shin. There's very little support to keep a sailor from falling overboard into the lake off the deck, especially if it were icy or slippery, or if the boat were rocking in heavy seas or waves washing across the deck. Not a lot to keep a guy from going overboard. Now we're at the main mast, working our way back towards the cabin. Wire rope sitting atop the aft hatch cover. There is a window that looks out of the front of that cabin, and in front of that window is what I believe is the bilge pump. We're going to get a really, really brief look inside. Yes, I know it's disappointing. I would have liked to have seen more from that angle as well. The sliding hatch cover with one missing board. It's one of the very few pieces of deterioration on this wreck. Coming over the fantail now. That starboard or port side lifeboat davit still in place. The steering gear. And the top boom from the sail had fallen right through there and narrowly missed shattering that wheel. We're going to come back at the cabin, and I'd like you to take a close look at the cabin doors. So there's actually two doors, like a bifold door system. And when Steve made his initial discovery dive in September of 2018, this door was standing and in place, and the cabin was closed. He was unable to glimpse any view inside that cabin. When we came back in spring of the following year, May of 2019, this had been, through the winter, had fallen down and was laying on the deck as you see it here. And take a look at that white porcelain doorknob. Just gorgeous. These are some really incredibly rare details. We're going to get a look inside the cabin, down a spiral staircase. There's a nice swirled pattern of silt that has collected on the bottom over the last century or so, presumably from water currents moving through the cabin and the silt actually settling out. We did not go inside the cabin. It was too tight a fit. There's that wheel just inches away from destruction when the sail boom came down. Strange twist of fate, and a tiny little aft cabin window. So while Steve was down there swimming around, Brian had his ROV down there as well. And Brian caught some very interesting footage of the wreck too, but from a little bit different perspective. Steve was up close and personal. Brian was off the wreck a little bit, and with the incredible visibility that we had that day, at 80 feet or better, Brian was able to get some great shots. And I put together a real short highlight reel of some of those looks that Brian's ROV took. There's that swept back stern. The sail booms had fallen kind of in place. We're very sure that this was under sail when it sank, especially with the fact that that top boom is still connected to the spar way up near the trestle tree. Here's a good look at that yawl boat. In the bow of the yawl boat, if you look carefully, you'll see a rigging block up here, which is what would have been used to suspend it with rigging from the davits. Of course, there's some of the holes from the damage when it fought the Kimball, as the Kimball dragged it down to the bottom with it. One of the reasons we have such good visibility here is probably because of the time of year. So the price that Steve paid for the good viz was the cold water. Now we're up near the bow, and we got a great shot at not only the bowsprit, but the jib boom, which is the extension to that bowsprit, still completely in place, undamaged. A lot of the running rigging draping on the lake bottom. The anchor's still there. Just a ghost ship. You could float this thing and it wouldn't take much to sail it away. Also, here is that smoking gun. This is that running light on the port side, still standing on top of the pole, well past a century on the bottom. Just incredible. At this point, when I saw this on the video while we were on the top side looking at Brian's ROV video, I knew that we had found the Kimball. Also, another shot at that windlass. Even the staysail boom is laying up atop that windlass and on the bow. All the parts of her are there. And a beautiful shot of those two majestic spars reaching 90 feet off the lake bottom. Just absolutely incredible. So let's talk about why we are completely convinced that this is the W.C. Kimball. Basically, it's obviously we don't have a name or a name board, but we have a preponderance of evidence. She's in the right place based on the debris that was washed up on the surface and on shore in historical records. We have an exact match to photos in every detail, as well as the uniqueness of the vessel, making it not like other ships for the most part. And those running lights, that's my smoking gun. Now, a little bit of history about the vessel. We haven't talked really about why it was where it is. She was built in Manitowoc, Wisconsin in 1888 and owned and operated for the first year and a half out of Milwaukee, then sold to a gentleman by the name of Marston Dame, who was from Northport, Michigan in 1890. It's unclear as to whether or not he sailed it much or not, but he shortly thereafter sold it to Charles Keel and James Stevens, both of Northport, Michigan as well. This was prior to the vessel's third season on the lake, and it was going to be the very maiden voyage in 1891 for the new owners with their new to them fast little schooner. They purchased it so that they could sell the potatoes from their potato farm and take it to various markets. So their very first maiden voyage, they loaded up with potatoes and they sailed to Chicago, where they unloaded a boat full of potatoes. And at that time, one of the crewmen, Henry Budd, hurt his leg. And that was going to be something that would be very fortunate for him, believe it or not. They sailed back to Manistee, where they picked up salt, 200 barrels full of it, put it in the hold, and they picked up 250,000 wooden roofing shingles and strapped them to the deck. They left Manistee on Friday and sailed right into a storm, and were never seen or heard from again, even though they were supposed to stop in Northport and then Traverse City. So who was aboard? Well, co-owner and captain James Stevens, 42 years old, and co-owner and first mate Charles Keel, who we have a picture here of, courtesy of Leelanau Historical Society. They had a friend who was a successful newspaper man and made his bones in Detroit, even though he was from Northport, William P. Wolfe. He was aboard. And also, as I mentioned before, crewman Henry Budd. This is the guy that injured his leg in Chicago when they were offloading the potatoes. When he got to Manistee, he decided it was just too uncomfortable of a ride on that little sailboat with that broken leg to go all the way back to Northport. So he left his crew and his friends behind, and he booked passage on a steamer for the final leg home. They needed somebody to pick up his slack, so they picked up this young 19-year-old Norwegian boy, doubtful how much English he even knew, probably just trying to pay passage from point A to point B. We have reason to believe he was relatively new here in the United States. Very unfortunate twist of fate for him. So what we know is that they sailed into a storm that was blowing from the west, and they were originally northbound up the shore of Michigan, but then they turned east by northeast, and they went past through the Manitou Passage. It was early in May, and it was northern Lake Michigan, so it's very likely that during that storm there was spray and freezing temps. The vessel, by design, had a very low freeboard, meaning the amount of vessel above the waterline. And it was already heavily laden with the shingles and the salt. And those low rails, it would have been extremely easy in a rolling, vicious sea for anybody to get just swept off that deck. The anchor, we know, was never deployed. The mainsail top boom is still attached to the top of the mast, and that tells us that she was under sail when she sank. And the yawl boat was never deployed. It was still attached and presumably had its tarp over it. That's what kept that oar in it as it was dragged 300 feet to the bottom of the lake. Of course, the tarp has since rotted away. But there's only two reasons, really, if you're on a sinking boat, that you don't try and get in that lifeboat, right? A, you either can't get it out of, it's encased in ice, or B, you're not even there in the first place to get in it. We know that the vessel submerged below the surface of the water very slowly. There were no big air buildups. The cabin is still in place. The deck hatch covers are still in place. Also, it sank very slowly, that 300-foot travel from the surface to the bottom of the lake, because there's no damage to it at all. It's sitting perfectly upright. It landed on the bottom just like a feather, and there's no deformation to the lake bottom itself. Usually when a boat plows into the bottom, it kicks up and digs into the silt and the clay, and it makes mounds and so forth. There's absolutely none of that around this thing. This is telling us that it was more than likely covered in some amount of ice, which helps explain the sinking in the first place, because the ice on a boat is a very dangerous thing. It's very heavy, and the boat is not designed to have that much weight above the water, and it can help push that boat down below. And once the boat is submerged and begins to sink as it fills with water, now the ice acts in the reverse, almost like an ineffectual life jacket, keeping it from racing to the bottom due to its weight. The cabin doors were still shut. The hatch was closed. So more than likely everyone was aboard. Everyone was on deck and at some point, and then probably swept overboard during the storm. And also the rudder has a slight turn to port. And that to me tells me that they were definitely sailing with a following sea. So her final hours were probably like something out of a Disney movie, a ghost ship, a veritable ghost ship, I think, probably sailing for minutes, if not hours, without anyone aboard any longer. She was more than likely covered in ice, crew washed overboard from the storm, lifeboat obviously never being deployed. It sank so slowly that it settled on the bottom without any damage, 300 feet down. A few shingles had been washed ashore, as was Charles Keel's wallet and the young Andreessen's trunk, but no bodies or other flotsam were ever recovered. And this also supports the ice theory. So that's what I think her final minutes were like. So that's what I have for you. I'd be thrilled to answer any questions. And again, Ross Richardson, I believe, is still with us. I hope he is. And so the man who found it, if you have questions for him, he would love to answer them as well.
So, Cal, it looks like the chats are going to go to you. So if you click on chat at the bottom, you should see if there are any questions in that list.
Okay. At the moment, it's looking pretty blank. I find it hard to believe that I haven't piqued the curiosity of someone. There's always somebody that has a great question. The only bad question is the one unasked, folks.
And now I'm blanking on the name, but on those side rails on the ship, you used an interesting name to describe some things that were sticking out.
Dead eyes?
Yes, that. What are those?
Dead eyes are part of the standing rigging. It's part of the shrouds and the stays that help keep the masts standing straight when they're under load. And they use rope kind of coiled through these wood blocks with holes in them to give them an ability to tighten or loosen that as needed. From Sandy Wagon File, I hope I didn't butcher that too bad, Sandy. Why would they design a ship with such low side rails? Great question. I don't really have a definitive answer for you. I'm thinking that it might just be less material, maybe easier to load things on the deck if there's less of a side rail. And safety, there was no OSHA back in the 1800s. Safety was really sort of not even a secondary notion to people. People died doing their job all the time, especially sailors, unfortunately.
Hi, Cal. Can you hear me?
Hey, Ross, welcome.
Hey, how's it going? Very, very interesting. Very interesting. Yeah, that is quite a shipwreck. Every time I see it, it just gives me chills. You know, thinking of those their crew's final minutes out there. We're usually out there in summer when things are kind of nice, but it can get pretty nasty out in that neck of the woods.
Absolutely. Ross, I just had a viewer ask a question. Do you contact descendants of the people involved when you find wrecks? You're maybe a little better suited to answer how we handled that with this wreck than I am, so I'll let you take that.
Yes, we got to meet Dr. Will, a descendant of Charles Keel, and we met him when we did some filming. You, Steve, and I, and then Brent Ashcroft and Evan, the cameraman, and we got to meet him and talk with him. He was a great nephew of Charles Keel, and we got to hear how the loss impacted his family. And he was in his 90s, and he was really touched when he looked at your image of the Kimball wreck site, which is amazing. His eyes teared up, and sadly, Dr. Will Thomas passed away in January.
Yeah, his eyes weren't the only ones tearing up, but when I saw how moved he was by being able to visualize the final resting place of his descendant, it was really a touching moment for everyone in the room, I think. And it was great that Brent and his cameraman Evan were able to capture that on tape as well.
Yes. And, you know, some lines like the Stevens, Captain Stevens, they didn't have any kids, so there are no descendants from him. You know, his family line was snuffed out. So
Good
that happened to a couple of different crewmen too. Same with the young Norwegian immigrant, young man, brave, coming over here for a new start, and you know, lost his life on the Great Lakes.
Yeah, like so many. You hear that story all the time of immigrants making their way here and they haven't even put down roots or settled down, and the vessel catches fire or some similar catastrophe. In my mind, I'm thinking of the very first shipwreck I ever dove when I became a diver years ago. It was the Niagara out of Port Washington. A paddle wheeler bringing immigrants from Scandinavia caught fire, and just a humongous loss of life. People jumping in the water to get away from the smoke and the flames, many who never even knew how to swim. A very common story across the Great Lakes over the centuries. Is there anyone else out there that would like to ask questions about the most intact schooner shipwreck in the world? Well, apparently not. I'm not seeing any other questions. So anyways, again, Amy, thank you for having me and listening to this story. I hope you found it as interesting as we do.
I did, and I hope everybody else enjoyed it. And yeah, these great stories about the Great Lakes and our history and how people are working to find out more about that. So thank you.
Ross is finding new shipwrecks all the time, aren't you, Ross?
I'm working on it.
Great.
All
Well,
right.
we'll look forward to hearing about more of them.
Very well. We'll stay in contact. And thank you to everyone who stayed with us through this long program. I appreciate it. Have a wonderful evening and be well.
Good night,
you.
everybody.